The Untold Story of Rommel. How the Third Reich silenced its greatest general. Let us travel back to the final autumn of World War II, to a quiet German village where one of the most brilliant military minds of the century faced the most harrowing decision of his life. Erwin Rommel, nicknamed the Desert Fox for his cunning strategies and admired by both allies and enemies, was a man caught between loyalty, honor, and survival. On that fateful October day in 1944, the world that once celebrated him as a hero would turn to seal his fate. Behind the closed doors of his Herrlingen home, under the watchful eyes of the Gestapo, the marshal who had once commanded thousands now stood utterly alone. Few know the intimate details of those final hours, moments of quiet despair, whispered goodbyes, and the heavy weight of a choice no man should face. Today, we revisit the last sunrise of the Desert Fox and uncover the truth hidden behind the official story. It was the autumn of 1944, and Germany was no longer the invincible force it had once seemed. The Allies had landed in Normandy that summer, pushing German forces back toward their own borders. In the east, the Soviet Red Army was advancing relentlessly, while Allied bombers darkened the skies over German cities. Inside the Third Reich, fear and suspicion grew like wildfire. Loyalty was constantly questioned, and even the most decorated officers could find themselves accused of treason overnight. Amid this collapsing empire stood Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Unlike most of the German high command, Rommel did not come from noble lineage. He rose through the ranks by sheer skill, gaining fame for his leadership in the North African campaign, where his daring maneuvers earned him respect from both sides. The British, his adversaries, called him a chivalrous opponent, while his own people revered him as a national hero. But Rommel's refusal to obey certain brutal orders, such as executing captured commandos or sacrificing troops in hopeless battles, had quietly made him enemies within Hitler's circle. By 1944, Rommel's career had shifted from battlefield glory to an uneasy post on Germany's Western Front, preparing defenses against an inevitable Allied invasion. After being wounded in July, he retreated to Herrlingen, a small village in southern Germany, to recover with his wife Lucia and teenage son Manfred. But Herrlingen was no sanctuary. The Gestapo's gaze followed him, and whispers linked him to the failed 20th of July plot to assassinate Hitler. Though never proven, the suspicion was enough. Orders came from Berlin. 2 generals would arrive at his home to discuss his future. History has shown what such meetings truly meant. The illusion of safety in Herrlingen. After his injury in July 1944, Rommel sought refuge in Herrlingen, believing the quiet countryside could shield his family from the war's chaos. The days were deceptively peaceful: morning walks in the garden with his son, meals shared at the family table, and the faithful companionship of his dachshund. But this calm was only a thin veil. Unknown to most, the Gestapo had already withdrawn his personal guard by higher orders, replacing protection with surveillance. Men in plain clothes watched the house from a distance. The road between Munich and Stuttgart was quietly prepared to be sealed at a moment's notice. Rommel had long suspected that enemies within the high command were whispering poison into Hitler's ear. These were not idle fears. On the 7th of September, his chief of staff, General Hans Speidel, was arrested by the Gestapo, accused of links to the 20th of July plot. Rommel understood then that the storm he had sensed was now closing in. Still, he stayed in Herrlingen. Perhaps it was stubbornness, or perhaps he believed that leaving would only draw more suspicion. The call from Berlin. On the 7th of October, 1944, Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel telephoned Rommel with a formal request. He was to travel to Berlin on the 10th for discussions about his future. Rommel, citing medical advice, refused. To Captain Aldinger, his loyal aide, he confided a chilling belief that he would never reach Berlin alive. His instincts would soon prove tragically accurate. 6 days later, on the 13th of October, a message from Stuttgart arrived. 2 generals, Wilhelm Burgdorf and Ernst Maesel, would visit Herrlingen the next day at noon. Aldinger tried to reassure him, suggesting the meeting might concern the ongoing battles or perhaps a new post. Rommel's silence spoke volumes. That night, the air in the Rommel household was heavy with unspoken dread. The morning of the 14th of October, the day began like any other, or at least that's how it seemed. Manfred had been allowed to return home, a small mercy in a tense autumn. After breakfast, father and son strolled through the garden, speaking quietly. "Today," Rommel told him, "I will know their plans for me. He dressed with deliberate care his leather Africa Korps jacket, the symbol of his proudest days. But outside, the trap was already in place. The Gestapo surrounded the property. The road was blocked. Escape was no longer an option, the choice no soldier should face. Just before noon, a dark green car bearing Berlin license plates rolled to a stop at the Rommel home. Two high-ranking generals stepped out: Wilhelm Burgdorf, the army personnel director, and Ernst Mazel, chief of the army's guard. Their arrival carried the thin politeness of official business, but Rommel knew it was the opening act of his final chapter. They asked to speak with him privately. His son Manfred, relieved that there was no immediate arrest, left the room with Captain Aldinger. Behind closed doors, the generals presented Rommel with what they called a choice. If he denied the charges of treason, he could plead his case before Hitler. If not, he would face arrest, interrogation, and almost certain execution by the People's Court. Burgdorf then revealed the truth. There was no real choice. If Rommel agreed to take his own life, the charges would remain secret, his family would be spared retribution, and he would be honored with a state funeral. His widow would receive a full pension, and his military achievements would be remembered with a monument. If he refused, the Gestapo would descend, and his family would suffer alongside him. Rommel understood instantly this was a death sentence disguised as mercy. He left the room and entered his wife's chamber. After a heavy silence, he told her, "In 15 minutes, I will be dead." Manfred, having overheard, stepped forward, his voice trembling with protest. Rommel explained in measured words. The house was surrounded. Hitler had accused him of high treason, and the generals carried a vial of poison that would kill within seconds. "It is better for one to die," he told his son, "than for all of us to be destroyed in a useless fight." The last farewell. He summoned Aldinger, who at first urged him to escape. "We've been in worse situations," Aldinger argued. But Rommel shook his head. The roads were blocked, the house cut off, the phone lines dead. To fight would mean the deaths of his wife and son. He chose instead to meet his end on his own terms. Outside, Burgdorf and Mazel waited by the gate. Villagers stood quietly along the roadside. Rommel walked out, his marshal's baton under his arm, shaking hands one last time with his son and Aldinger. Then he entered the waiting car. 500 meters down the road, the car pulled into a clearing. Burgdorf dismissed the others, leaving Rommel alone. Minutes later, when they returned, the marshal was slumped in the back seat, cyanide still burning in his mouth. His legendary composure had held until the very end. The aftermath and the official story. Back in Herlingen, the minutes dragged in suffocating silence. About 20 minutes after the car had departed, the telephone rang. Captain Aldinger answered. The voice on the other end reported that Field Marshal Rommel had died officially, from complications of the injuries he had suffered months earlier in Normandy. It was a convenient fiction, crafted to protect the Reich's image and mask the reality of political execution. The Gestapo remained stationed around the Rommel home, not to honor him, but to ensure the truth stayed buried. In reality, they had orders to storm the room and kill him had he resisted the suicide plan. Rommel's family understood this and kept their silence. Manfred, bound by his father's request, carried the truth for decades. Days later, Hitler himself sent a message to Lucia Rommel, feigning sorrow for the sensitive loss of your dear husband, and promising that the name of Marshal Rommel will forever be associated with the heroic campaigns of North Africa. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels echoed the sentiment, writing of Rommel as one of Germany's most illustrious leaders, while Hermann Goering added that he had died as a hero. End quote. It was a performance, a final act of the regime's theater, ensuring the public saw Rommel not as a traitor, but as a national hero who succumbed to war wounds. On the 18th of October, 1944, his funeral was held with full military honors. Soldiers and dignitaries stood in solemn ranks, saluting the man who, just days earlier, had been condemned in secret by the very state they represented. His remains were cremated and buried in Herlingen Cemetery, a modest grave for a man whose name had once commanded armies. Few people outside Rommel's closest circle ever knew the exact mechanics of his final moments, and even fewer have heard the tiny details that give his last day its haunting texture. One of the most poignant truths is that Rommel's famed leather Africa Korps jacket worn during his proudest days in the desert was the garment he chose to meet death in. It was not vanity, but a deliberate gesture, a final tie to the part of his life where honor felt untainted. Another little-known fact is that the Gestapo's preparations for his death were meticulous. Hours before the generals arrived, plainclothes agents had quietly sealed every possible escape route. Even the small country lanes surrounding Herlingen were blocked, ensuring that if Rommel had attempted to flee on foot or by car, he would have been intercepted within minutes. The operation had been planned with the precision of a military maneuver, except the target was not an enemy of the Reich, it was one of its own most decorated soldiers. There is also the curious account of the car ride to the forest clearing. Eyewitness testimony later revealed that Bergdorf, the senior general, insisted on stepping away with Maisel and the driver before Rommel took the poison. They walked far enough that when the vial was crushed between Rommel's teeth, no one heard his last breath. When they returned, they found him slumped but still faintly moving. The potassium cyanide was working, but not instant. He gasped for several seconds before going still. Even in death, secrecy remained paramount. The Gestapo controlled the flow of information so tightly that for decades many Germans genuinely believed Rommel had succumbed to war injuries. The truth only emerged long after the war ended, pieced together from testimonies, letters, and the memories of a son who had promised to stay silent until it was safe to speak. The sun set quietly over Herlingen on the 14th of October, 1944, drawing the final curtain on the life of Erwin Rommel, a man celebrated as a brilliant strategist, respected by foes, and ultimately destroyed by the very regime he had served. His death was wrapped in ceremony and falsehood, yet beneath the layers of propaganda lay the stark truth. Rommel's end was not on a battlefield, but in a silent clearing, betrayed by politics and bound by his love for his family. In the years that followed, the myth of the Desert Fox endured. To some, he was a symbol of chivalry in a war defined by brutality. To others, he was a cautionary tale of loyalty, misplaced in the service of a corrupt power. But no matter the interpretation, his final choice, swift death in exchange for his family's safety, remains one of the most human and tragic decisions of the Second World War. The grave in Herlingen is modest, almost unremarkable, yet for those who know the full story, it is a place heavy with history. The man buried there once commanded armies across continents, yet in the end, he could command only the manner of his own death. And now, I ask you, when you think of Erwin Rommel, what remains strongest in your mind, his legendary victories, or the quiet, unflinching courage of his last day?